So welcome everybody to the new series of Future Sales Factory Fireside Chats. I'm Matthew Quinn from Future Sales Factory. Future Sales Factory is very blessed as a business to have lots of partners and friends and colleagues who have inspirational stories, which during this strange time in 2020 we thought we'd share with you in an informal setting where we can have a little chat with people and see if we can get some lessons out there. First up, we have a friend of mine called Ruaridh. Now, Rory I've known for quite some years, and we've actually shared a couple of adventures together, which has been great. But I first came across Rory when a mutual friend of ours told me about a project that he did. Rory made a film under his own time, and this film won various awards, including a BAFTA. And he's recently managed to write a book about it as well, which I'm very proud to have a copy. So I'm delighted to introduce Rory here today to talk to us a little bit about his project. Rory, how are you?
Good, thanks, Matthew. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about how to start a revolution. Tell us the story.
Well, it's how to start a revolution anywhere, really. And basically the film came about because when I was sort of basically quite a junior journalist, and every time I used to sort of cover sort of the Orange Revolution or the Georgian Revolution in 2003, the protesters would say, "Oh, we're using the same book. It's by this guy called Gene Sharp." And after about the fourth time I'd heard this, I thought, this is a bit weird. This sounds like a bit of a CIA sort of conspiracy. Like, there's loads of revolutions all over the world, and they're all using the same book by a strange American academic. There's got to be something quite funny going on here. So I tried to cover it during my day job, but everyone was like, "You're crazy. Like, this is not a story. Just don't touch it." But I was completely fascinated. I felt like I had to solve this mystery. Who was this mysterious guy, Gene Sharp, who no one had ever heard of, but who was kind of influencing all these revolutions? So I sent a couple of emails, found out where he worked, sort of roughly where he was, kept sending lots of emails, and eventually I got a reply back from the executive director of his organization. And that organization was called the Albert Einstein Institution. And it really only had two members of staff, him and his executive director, a woman called Jamila Rakib. And together, these two people basically served as a sort of center where if you wanted to take down a dictatorship or you were suffering under some kind of oppression, you went there for advice and help about how to do that.
We've got a little clip.
My name is Gene Sharp, and this is the work I do.
What this work does is show people that they can be responsible for their own future.
It worked in Georgia, it worked in Ukraine, it worked in many other places in the world. This is the way you do.
Non-violent struggle is armed struggle.
Gene Sharp's theories are being practiced on the streets of Syria as we speak now.
Gene Sharp, How to Start a Revolution.
Fantastic clip. This was basically like a consulting group for revolutionaries.
Yeah, at first I thought it could be like a consulting group, because you think about it like this big sort of flashy Washington organization with plasma screens everywhere. They're like controlling stuff. But in fact, what it was kind of like almost like a Wizard of Oz story. I went to see the Wizard of Oz, and what actually was there when I pulled back the curtain was a kind of 83-year-old man. They were sort of operating a very small unit out of Gene Sharp's house. Gene Sharp had been a Harvard academic. He studied in the UK, studied at Oxford and in Norway. And then he basically distilled down a sort of set of rules from decades of study of how you would overthrow a dictatorship. And really, by just sort of word of mouth, this guide from dictatorship to democracy just spread around the world. So most of the revolutions you see today are using Gene Sharp's guidebook. And yet no one really knows this story very well. So that was my kind of mission. I was like, I have to tell the story. This is like the most important man like nobody has heard of, and the story is just incredible. So I was like, just quit everything. I've got to tell this story.
So you were a junior journalist, as you say. I mean, was this kind of a story that was of interest to your bosses? Could you go to them and say, look, I want a budget. I want to investigate this guy. Give me some money and I can do it properly. Or did they just think you were insane?
They just thought I was insane. And I think the other thing it's not neat, but this happened over a number of years. So I started out and I was a trainee newspaper journalist. And by the time I actually took action on it, I was actually sort of relatively junior producer, sort of just starting to make documentaries for the BBC and National Geographic. And what happens when you say, I want to make this documentary about something to a commissioning editor or a documentary house, is they say, okay, but where's the picture? So when you say, I want to make this documentary about this 83-year-old man who lives in this tumble-down house in this kind of working class area of East Boston with one person, and this is where revolutionaries come for advice to bring down their government. They're like, but what does he do? You can't make a documentary about an old guy who sits at a desk and he doesn't really do anything anymore and he's kind of retired. And I was like, no, this is an amazing story. It's kind of like, it's almost the adventure story, not just of him, but of his book, where it goes, the revolutionary leaders it goes to, what they do with it. And in a way, that is the challenge, isn't it? I mean, for us as documentary makers and storytellers, that some of the most important people in the world are not the people who are like, sort of abseiling down a building or, riding motorbikes. They're like, the people like who developed the Pfizer vaccine. Those are people who really should save the world. Try making a documentary about the guy who's like, looking at very complicated mathematical models and looking at CRISPR and how you splice DNA to overcome that. So that's our challenge. It's to make those kind of people, the real heroes who are not very exciting, visually interesting, and to make cool films about them. So that I felt was the major challenge to do that. But then I also had major challenges about how to physically do it and how to fund it.
Okay, so how did you physically do it? You've got this idea. Gene Sharp's out there, kind of with his Zimmer frame and his walking stick, and he's sitting behind a desk somewhere. You found him.
Yeah.
What did you do next?
Well, I didn't really have very much money, but I knew that basically what I was really terrified of is I realised that this guy was probably the most important political thinker of our generation. He was going to be like Machiavelli or Clausewitz, but these people tend to not be recognised until after they've died. And what I was really terrified of is that he was going to die before I got there. So I just, there was not time to put all the pieces in place. So I just basically gathered together all the savings I had. And I found a good friend who's an amazing cameraman. And we just got on a plane. And I knew I didn't have enough money to make a documentary, and I didn't have all the pieces in place. But I just thought, well, if we just do an interview with Gene, then we've got it, that, if anything terrible happened to him, I can still make a documentary in the future, or someone else can. What matters is his story is preserved for history. So we did that, and then we came back, and then I was kind of broke again, and went back to my day job. And then very slowly, after over the course of 2 years, which seemed to last forever, I kind of got paid for my day job. Then on a weekend, I would go away and find a group of revolutionaries in Serbia or Istanbul or one of these strange places, the Egyptians, and go and interview them. And then I'd take this back. But it happened very slowly and around my day job, and I never thought it was going to finish.
When you say I went out and I found a group of revolutionaries, now. But for me, I mean, we've known each other a while, Rory, so you know that I'm kind of, I like to come up with some strange ideas, but I wouldn't know where to start to go and find a group of revolutionaries. I mean, how does one do that?
Well, it's all about taking the first step. I mean, you always hear these in podcasts and management tutorials and all this kind of inspirational talks. It is about just taking that first step. Yeah, it seems completely mad, doesn't it? But once I'd taken that first step to see Gene, then he'd be like, well, I guess I can introduce you to this group of revolutionaries who came here for advice, and they're off starting this, and maybe you can talk to them, I'll ask them, and you can follow, and literally you just follow that trail, and you get to them and win their trust, and then they say, well, we learned a bit from this person, and they're in this country, and then get a cheap flight, and then go there. So you're just unpicking this problem that at the beginning seems so vast, and that you couldn't touch it, and it seems undoable. But just by taking small steps towards it, gradually got there.
And were you ever kind of scared?
Well, I mean, we have to say, first of all, I was doing a film about non-violent revolution, right? So in general, these were people who had sort of committed to non-violence as a strategic sort of weapon. But what is interesting is that there's always this decisive moment when you interview these people. Young sort of revolutionaries kind of can go one of two ways, as we've seen in history, always. They're normally sort of very well educated, very committed, and there's normally a conversation at some point where they go, well, should we do this violently? Should we get weapons because we're connected enough internationally to do that? Or should we take a non-violent option? And what I found was really kind of amazing about Gene Sharp's work is it provided something, a kind of moment where they could say, okay, let's try this first. Let's try the non-violent option first, because Gene Sharp has provided us with this kind of this guidebook. So let's try this before we go there. So in many cases, Gene Sharp's work had either slowed a move to violence or stopped it completely. And that's why he was so important. And eventually got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize about 4 times, although sadly didn't get it.
Oh, so what was the turning point then? What actually made, because this film that you're making and you're spending a lot of your free time doing it, won awards, right? You won a BAFTA for it?
Yeah, eventually. So
what was the turning point? What actually brought it together? What made the film actually happen? What made it so popular?
Well, I guess the crunch point is timing. So I was like beating myself up, and this is a good lesson for anyone who's doing this on any kind of creative project or any good project at all. That I felt so terrible because it was taking so long to do it, and people were starting to laugh at me, and my friends were starting to joke. This is like this film would never be finished, and actually the time it took was the strength, because I started to get to finish it at the end of 2010. And I was visiting the Serbs and the Serbian revolutionary group that brought down Milosevic in 2000. And the leader of that revolution, Srđan Popović, was like, oh, you just missed this group of Egyptians. They were just here not so long ago. And this was in 2010, right? So everyone thinks the Arab Spring is this big thing, just like happened as a spark, just kicked off. But there was a lot of planning going on a long time before that. And this was the first sort of little bell that rang. I was like, oh, that's weird. I went home for Christmas. And then, of course, in January, the Arab Spring basically kicks off in 2011. So we're coming up for the 10th anniversary of that. And I was like, well, I've got to get on a plane. I don't have any affiliation. I don't have any, at that point, I didn't have, no one was going to send me from the BBC. So they were sort of basically airlifting tourists out of Egypt. And I went in on a kind of empty 747. And I was like, this is because at this point, the film is like interesting, but kind of like geeky interesting, might sit on an academic shelf and be like referenced by some PhD students, right? So we've got there. And I'm quite happy with that. But then suddenly a massive revolution is happening. And by the way, Gene Sharp's work is being used in it. So I'm like, I have to get in there. So I landed in Egypt, and almost immediately I was arrested by the secret police. I was hauled into a cell. and I was like, well, and actually it was quite funny because my friend who became the executive producer of the film, a guy called Richard Shaw, was a brilliant guy who'd run comms for the Royal Opera House and was an amazing documentary producer. And he said, darling, you've got to go to Egypt. He said, but to be honest, by the time you arrive, it'll all be over and you'll be drinking cocktails by the Nile. And this rang through my mind as I was being torn by the Egyptian secret police into the cell and down into a seat. And of course I did my routine of I'm just here. I'm a tourist. And they're like, why are you here, Mr. Arrow? And I was like, I'm going to see the pyramids. And they're like, rubbish, you're not going to see the pyramids. Why are you here? They start going through my stuff. And
is it to the old Salisbury Cathedral?
Exactly that. What are you talking about? I'm like, this is a beautiful country with renowned pyramids, and this is where I'm going. And so they go through my bags, and the first thing they pull out is my camera, which looks like kind of like normal DSLR camera, and that's what I was planning on using. So you could pass that off as a tourist camera. And then so they were like, let me see the inside of it. So see the memory card. And they thought they had me at this point. And then they start flicking through the photos, and I'd completely forgotten what was on the memory card. But what was on it was pictures of the sheep from our field back at home, which completely threw them. So they were like, what is this guy? So I was like, see, a sheep. I'm not a journalist at all. But eventually they found my recording equipment, which is kind of a giveaway as a professional. So they took all that. They kept me there for ages. I was really quite scared, because at this point the police were disbanding and they were kind of running away, and I was left in this cell. And it's an awful psychological moment when you don't know if anyone is ever coming back, and they haven't told, I laugh about it now, but they haven't told anyone you're there. They've just left this British guy in the cell, and they think that's hilarious, and no one is going to know. But eventually they did come back, and a guy basically asked for a bribe to get out. And I went straight into Tahrir Square. And again, some more secret police got me there. And they were like, if you go in there, we're going to find you and we're going to kill you tonight. And by that point, there were so many secret police behind me, I couldn't really go back to my hotel. So I had to go into the square. And once I was in the square, I just wasn't leaving. So I ended up sleeping on the pavement alongside the protesters during sort of like the most intense period of the uprising. And it was the most amazing experience, completely biblical. But once that happened, I came back with the footage. I basically was able to add the Egyptian Revolution and my experience in it to the end of the film. And suddenly it became the first cinema documentary out about the Arab Spring. And suddenly it went from being a geeky, a weird film that was made on a kitchen table in Inverness into being a film that was like sold in like 40 countries, translated into 20 languages, won Rain Dance, the screening on Sundance this week, and won a Scottish BAFTA, and lots of other awards all over the world. The smallest kind of BAFTA you can get, but it's still it's quite nice.
Superb. And it's still being screened now. You said it's being screened this week.
It's being screened this week in Sundance. I mean, it's had an amazing life, because revolutionary groups in various places have translated it themselves, and they've shown it in like secret groups. So it's been shown in China. I recently met a man who's been put in prison for 5 years by the Chinese for screening the film.
Really?
Yeah. And that was that Gene sadly died 2 years ago, and we organised his funeral, and we managed to get some people there some of the revolutionaries who'd used the work, including the Syrians and Serbs and people. So there were some incredible stories. But yeah, I mean, and even after Trump had been elected, the PBS, the US network, they played How to Start a Revolution directly after a frontline investigation into sort of fraud on his election. So whenever there's an uprising or they think there's some sort of revolutionary activity, the film comes back. And what's kind of nice is that, I mean, it is, it feels quite out of date, and it's a very kind of naively film from a first-time filmmaker. But yeah, it still seems to really kind of touch people. And I think that's just because it has a sort of very kind of raw honesty about it.
Now, you have recently turned this into a book. And you said that one of the good things about lockdown is the fact you actually managed to write the book. Tell us a little bit about the book's journey.
Well, shortly after the Arab Spring and finishing the film, I got invited to have basically a research position at Harvard, where I was able to kind of look into the academics of this a bit more, and to start writing a book about effectively a biography of Gene Sharp and how these different revolutionary movements had learned from each other. So that was quite a long time ago, because I had to do my day job. I had to come back to London and do my day job of working for Newsnight at the BBC. But, again, kind of like how the film was produced, just in my spare time over the past few years, I've been inching away at writing the book. And it's basically the biography of Gene Sharp, and then it turns sort of halfway through into this story of like where the text goes, where his book goes, which revolutionaries used it and how they used it, and potentially how that can be used by the climate movement, Black Lives Matter, all those movements that rely on sort of non-violent movements and tactics, and how they can sort of learn from each other, basically. And that was there were lots of terrible things about lockdown, but one of the great things was that I was able to just concentrate for the last few months and just really get the book finished. So it's here. This is it. Gene Sharp, How to Start a Revolution. And yeah, it was just fantastic fun to write. It is an amazing story. It's almost like the Forrest Gump of revolutions. Gene just arrived in the most amazing places from everywhere. From he was present when the peace symbol was first produced and used on the anti-nuclear march. He was in Tiananmen Square. He was there trying to convince Yasser Arafat to not make the First Intifada violent, in the jungles of Burma, like right up to present day, kind of like Russia and sort of the end of the Cold War. And there's now evidence that Russia is actually using his tactics back against the US to manipulate elections. So that's a really interesting and great ending point for the book.
And any lessons that you think can be drawn from your experiences that will help people in COVID and getting 2020 behind him and things like that? What do you think you've learned from doing this?
I think the whole story about, for me personally, is about taking those first steps, even when you think something is impossible or you don't have enough time. Just use the time that you have to take that step forward, because it leads to other things. Even if you think it's impossible and that isn't something that can take you the full way, if you start, often that solution will present itself. And lockdown for me has been a lot of learning and just realizing that actually, people say this about prison, which has a stultifying effect on the mind, that actually when you have a lot of space and time, it actually can degrade your creativity and your ability to do things. But I think for me, it's been about lists, doing small things just that make you happy, that cheer you up, lots of exercise in any form that can be for you, and just doing small things, small steps forward will get you there in the end.
Just before we finish, if you were to go on an adventure next year, where would you go? What would you do? Who would you be with? And you can, anybody, famous people or people you know, anything like that. Where would you go? Who would you be with? And what would you do?
So for a really long time, I've wanted to ski across Greenland. So that is my big next adventure. And I think it's just such a beautiful place, and I'm really kind of worried that the ice cap might not be there for that much longer. And to sort of document that properly, I'd like to take one of those Google backpacks with me, so that you could actually track the journey that Nansen, the explorer Nansen, did in his first crossing of Greenland, so that would always be there for posterity, that sort of that brilliance of the ice and the ice cap.
You could drag me. That's perfect. I could just sit there drinking gin. That sounds like a perfect adventure for me.
Brilliant. We're all set then.
We're all set. I'll book the tickets as soon as we're able to travel. Listen, Rory, it's been a delight. What a delight to see you. What a delight to talk to you. Always fascinated by the story of how to start a revolution. I hope the book does really well. I'm sure it will. We'll fit some kind of link to it somewhere on this video. But other than that, mate, take the very best of care, and hopefully we'll get ourselves to Greenland next year.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. It's been fun.